The wind howling off Lake Michigan that December night wasn't just cold, it was a predator. It hunted for the weak, the forgotten, and the desperate. Thomas Caldwell wrapped his threadbare coat tighter around his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, whose lips were turning a terrifying shade of blue. They had nowhere left to go. The shelters were full, their pockets were empty, and the city of Chicago had turned its back on them. But as Thomas dragged his freezing legs down a forsaken alley off Wabash Avenue, a rusted, chained-up door of a forgotten diner caught his eye. He didn't know it yet, but breaking that lock wouldn't just save their lives tonight. It would ignite a chain of events that would shake the entire city to its core. Before the medical bills, before the eviction, and before the soul-crushing reality of the streets, Thomas Caldwell had been a man of the kitchen. He was a respected sous chef at a bustling downtown bistro. He knew the chaotic symphony of clashing pans, the searing heat of the grill, and the precise chemistry of a perfect hollandaise. But life has a cruel way of stripping a man of his titles. When his wife, Catherine, lost her battle with leukemia 2 years ago, Thomas lost his anchor. The grief swallowed his focus, the hospital debt swallowed his savings, and soon the landlord swallowed their keys. Now, his only title was homeless, and his only objective was keeping his daughter alive. It was Christmas Eve, and the temperature had plummeted to -12 degrees. Snow fell in heavy, blinding sheets, burying the sidewalks and forcing the city's inhabitants behind double-glazed windows and blazing hearths. Thomas and Lily were huddled in the doorway of a closed pawn shop, but the wind whipped around the alcove, mercilessly stealing their body heat. Lily's shivering had slowed down, a terrifying physiological sign that hypothermia was setting in. Her small head rested against his chest, her breathing shallow. "Daddy, I want to go to sleep," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the roar of the blizzard. "No, sweetheart," Thomas pleaded, shaking her gently. Panic gripped his throat. "You can't sleep yet. We have to keep moving. We're playing a game, remember? The explorer game." He forced himself to his feet, hauling Lily up and carrying her in his arms. He stumbled blindly down the street, turning down an alley behind the financial district to escape the biting headwind. The alley was a canyon of brick and steel dumpsters, dark and foreboding. As he trudged through the knee-deep snow, he tripped over a frozen trash bag and slammed into a brick wall. Gasping for air, he looked up. Beside him was a heavy steel door, covered in decades of grime and graffiti. Above it, barely visible under a layer of ice, was a faded wooden sign, the Brass Bell. It was an old restaurant, shuttered and forgotten. The windows facing the main street were boarded up with thick plywood, and the building looked as though it hadn't seen a customer since the late 90s. The back door was secured by a heavy, rusted padlock. Thomas looked at Lily. Her eyes were closed. He had minutes before the cold took her completely. Adrenaline, fueled by pure paternal terror, surged through his veins. He looked around the alley frantically and spotted a heavy, rusted iron pipe jutting out from a discarded radiator. He grabbed the pipe, his bare hands sticking slightly to the freezing metal. He approached the padlock. He didn't care about trespassing. He didn't care about the law. He cared about the 6-year-old girl fading in the snow. Thomas raised the pipe and brought it down on the padlock with a primal scream. The metal clanged loudly, the sound absorbed by the falling snow. He struck it again and again, his hands bleeding and tearing from the impact. On the 5th strike, the brittle, rusted, internal mechanism of the lock shattered. The hasp gave way. Thomas dropped the pipe, grabbed Lily, and shoved his shoulder against the heavy door. It groaned, resisting for a moment before giving way to the darkness inside. He practically fell into the building, kicking the door shut behind him to block out the shrieking wind. The silence inside was immediate and deafening. It was freezing, but there was no wind. It was a stagnant, ancient cold. Thomas fumbled in his pocket for his cheap lighter, flicking the wheel until a tiny, flickering yellow flame illuminated the gloom. They were standing in a commercial kitchen, dust coated every surface like gray snow. Stainless steel prep tables, tarnished and dull, stood like monuments in a graveyard. An enormous industrial stove sat against the far wall, its burners black and silent. Thomas laid Lily down on a prep table, brushing the dust away with his sleeve. He took off his coat and piled it on top of her, rubbing her hands and feet frantically. "Lily, wake up. Look, we found a castle. We're inside. It's safe," he murmured, his tears freezing on his cheeks. He needed to warm her. He took his lighter and began searching the kitchen. In the corner, next to the dishwashing station, he found a stack of old, dry cardboard boxes and a pile of ancient paper menus. He dragged them into the center of the kitchen floor, far away from any grease traps, and built a small fire. As the flames caught, casting dancing shadows on the tiled walls, the temperature in their small circle began to rise. Thomas pulled Lily off the table and held her close to the fire. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the blue tint began to fade from her lips. She coughed, burying her face into his chest. "Warm," she mumbled. Thomas let out a sob of relief, kissing the top of her dirty, tangled hair. "Yeah, baby, it's warm. We're going to be okay." They slept that night, curled around the dying embers of cardboard on the hard tile floor, unaware that the building they had just broken into was owned by one of the most ruthless real estate development firms in Chicago, Pendleton and Hayes Holdings. Morning broke not with sunlight, but with a dull, gray sliver of daylight seeping through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. Thomas woke up stiff and aching, his bones protesting against the hard floor, but Lily was breathing steadily, her cheeks flushed with a healthy pink. Thomas stood up and stretched, taking in his surroundings in the daylight. The brass bell was a relic. He pushed through the swinging doors into the dining room. It was a classic mid-century diner. Red vinyl booths, slashed and faded, lined the walls. A long counter with spinning chrome stools sat in the center. The dust here was thick, preserving the room in an eerie stillness. He walked behind the counter. The cash register was gone, ripped out, leaving dangling wires. But as a chef, Thomas's eyes naturally gravitated back to the kitchen. He returned to the back, his professional instincts kicking in despite his circumstances. He began opening cupboards and pulling out deep storage bins. Most were empty, cleared out when the restaurant went under. But in the dry storage pantry at the very back, beneath a collapsed shelf, he spotted a massive, heavy-duty plastic drum with a tightly sealed screw-top lid. It took him 10 minutes of grunting and wrestling to unscrew the lid, which had practically fused shut over the years. When it finally popped off, a puff of dry air escaped. Inside, perfectly preserved by the airtight seal, were 50 pounds of flour. Thomas couldn't believe his eyes. He dug deeper into the pantry. He found a forgotten pallet of canned goods pushed against the wall, commercial-size number 10 cans. Most of the labels had rotted away, but he managed to pry one open with a rusted paint scraper he found in a drawer. Crushed tomatoes, preserved in their own acidity, still perfectly good. He also found a massive shaker of coarse sea salt and a half-empty jug of dried oregano. It wasn't a feast, but to a man who had been eating out of garbage cans for a month, it was a Michelin-starred inventory. But he needed water and a way to cook. He checked the taps at the dish pit. Nothing. The city had shut the water off years ago. However, he found a large stock pot, took it to the back door, and scooped it full of clean, fresh snow from the alley. Next was the heat. He examined the massive 6-burner Wolf gas range. The main gas line from the city was undoubtedly severed, but underneath the counter, to his absolute shock, he found 2 large, dusty propane tanks hooked up to a backup flat-top griddle, a common setup for older restaurants to keep the grill running during power outages. He turned the valve on the tank. A faint hiss greeted him. It wasn't full, but it had enough pressure. He turned the dial on the flat top and struck his lighter. With a soft whoosh, a row of blue flames roared to life under the heavy iron plate. Thomas smiled for the first time in a year. He brought the snow-filled pot to the heat to melt and boil. He took a bowl, scooped out a mound of flour, added a pinch of the ancient salt, and slowly mixed in the warm water once it had melted. His hands, though calloused and battered from the streets, moved with practiced grace. He was kneading dough. He let it rest, then rolled it out flat, using an old, heavy glass bottle. He poured the crushed tomatoes into a saucepan, seasoned them with salt and oregano, and let them simmer. The smell of reducing tomatoes and herbs hit the stagnant air of the kitchen, chasing away the scent of dust and rot. It smelled like home. It smelled like life. He slapped the flatbread dough onto the hot, greased griddle. It sizzled loudly, puffing up and blistering with beautiful dark brown spots. Lily woke up to the smell. She wandered into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes, clutching her ragged stuffed bear. Her eyes widened as she saw her father standing over the stove, a makeshift apron tied from a torn tablecloth around his waist. "Daddy?" she asked, bewildered. "Are we in a restaurant?" "We're in our restaurant, Lilybug," Thomas said, flipping the hot bread onto a plate and ladling the rich, steaming tomato sauce over it. "Breakfast is served." They sat on overturned milk crates and ate. It was just flour, water, tomatoes, and salt, but to them, it was a divine banquet. The hot food radiated warmth through their hollow bodies. As they were eating, a sudden, sharp rapping sound came from the back door. Thomas froze. The bite of bread turned to ash in his mouth. If it was the police, they would be arrested for trespassing. Worse, child services would take Lily away. That was his greatest nightmare. He held a finger to his lips, signaling Lily to be quiet. He silently picked up the heavy iron pipe he had used to break the lock and crept toward the door. "I know someone's in there," a raspy, gravelly voice called out from the alley. "I can smell the tomatoes." "Man, I ain't smelled real food like that since '98. Thomas hesitated. The voice didn't sound like a cop. It sounded tired. Thomas unlocked the door and pulled it open just an inch, gripping the pipe tightly. Standing in the freezing alley was an older man, wrapped in an absurd number of mismatched coats. He wore a tattered military beanie and had a thick, frost-covered beard. He was trembling violently. "Name's Desmond," the man croaked, his eyes darting to the warm glow of the kitchen behind Thomas. "I sleep by the vents 2 blocks down." The wind shifted, smelled the herbs, thought I was hallucinating. "Please, brother, I'm freezing to death out here." Thomas looked at the man's desperate eyes. He knew that look. It was the same look he saw in his own reflection in the pawnshop windows. He looked back at Lily, who was watching him with wide, innocent eyes. Thomas lowered the pipe. He pulled the door open wider. "Come in, Desmond," Thomas said softly. "I just put a fresh piece of bread on the grill." That single act of charity changed the trajectory of Thomas's life. Desmond, a Vietnam veteran who had slipped through the cracks of society decades ago, ate the flatbread and tomato ragu with tears streaming down his face. "You're a wizard, man," Desmond said, wiping his mouth with a filthy sleeve. "I ain't felt this full in years." Desmond didn't just leave after his meal. He became Thomas's eyes and ears on the streets. He showed Thomas where to find a functioning water spigot in an underground parking garage 2 blocks away. He showed him which dumpsters behind the luxury grocery stores yielded the best. Unspoiled produce discarded due to minor blemishes. Within a week, Thomas had established a routine. At 3 a.m., while Lily slept safely in a booth, Thomas had padded with scavenged blankets. He and Desmond would head out with a stolen shopping cart. They hit the produce markets, the bakery loading docks, and the wholesale butchers. It was incredible what the city threw away. Slightly bruised eggplants, day-old sourdough loaves, massive bones, with plenty of meat still attached, discarded merely because they weren't aesthetically pleasing enough for the display cases. Thomas brought the haul back to the brass bell. He spent his days cleaning the kitchen, scrubbing the decades of grime off the stainless steel until it shone. He repaired a massive cast-iron soup kettle he found in the basement. By the second week of January, the brutal winter showed no signs of stopping. The homeless population of Chicago was dying in the streets. Word had spread through the invisible network of the destitute. A whisper passed between shivering souls huddled over exhaust grates. "There's a chef on 43rd Street. The food is hot. The door is open in the alley." They started coming at midnight, a silent procession of ghosts, knocking gently on the heavy steel door. Thomas let them in. He seated them at the clean prep tables in the back, away from the windows so no light would bleed through the plywood boards and alert the street. Thomas didn't just slop food onto plates. He cooked with pride. He took the discarded beef bones, roasted them over the propane flame, and simmered them with snow water, bruised carrots, and wilted celery to create a rich, dark, velvety bone broth. He baked the stale bread into crusty croutons. He made ratatouille out of rescued vegetables. He treated the city's outcasts like patrons at a five-star dining establishment. "Good evening, gentlemen," Thomas would say, walking out with a tray of mismatched, chipped bowls he had scavenged from the basement. "Tonight, we have a slow-simmered beef consommé with root vegetable hash, accompanied by toasted sourdough." The men and women who ate there wept. It wasn't just the warmth of the food, it was the restoration of their dignity. For an hour a night, they weren't invisible. They were guests, they were human. Desmond appointed himself the maitre d' and head of security. He managed the line outside in the alley, ensuring no one made too much noise, and cleaned the bowls in a bucket of melted, soapy snow water. Lily, proud of her father, drew menus on the back of old receipts with a found crayon, handing them out to the weary souls. The Midnight Diner, they called it. It was a beacon of hope in a city of ice. But a secret like that cannot stay buried forever, especially when it sits on prime real estate. Arthur Pendleton was a man who viewed the world in terms of spreadsheets, profit margins, and demolition schedules. As the senior partner of Pendleton and Hayes Holdings, he owned the block that housed the Brass Bell. He had intentionally let the building rot, waiting for the neighborhood property values to plummet so he could buy up the adjacent lots for pennies before leveling the whole block to build a massive, lucrative luxury condominium tower. It was late January. The permits for demolition were finally pushed through City Hall, greased by a few generous campaign donations. Pendleton, a man who liked to personally oversee his victories, ordered his driver to take him down to 43rd Street to inspect the site before the wrecking balls arrived the following Monday. It was 1 a.m. The black Lincoln town car glided silently through the snow-packed streets, pulling to a halt across from the boarded-up diner. Pendleton stepped out, pulling his cashmere coat tightly against the wind. He looked at the dilapidated structure with disgust, but as he stood there on the icy sidewalk, his eyes narrowed. There was a faint, almost imperceptible column of heat shimmering from the rusty ventilation pipe on the roof, and the air smelled faintly of roasting garlic and thyme. Pendleton scowled. Squatters, the absolute bane of his existence. If the city inspectors found squatters in the building, the demolition would be delayed by weeks of legal eviction tape. "Wait here," Pendleton snapped at his driver. He didn't call the police. He wanted to handle this quietly and forcefully. Pendleton walked down the alley, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the ice. He heard the faint murmur of voices. He approached the heavy steel back door. It was slightly ajar to let out the heat of the kitchen. Pendleton pushed the door open violently. It crashed against the brick wall with a deafening bang. Inside the kitchen, 30 homeless men and women froze, their spoons halfway to their mouths. Thomas, standing at the stove, pouring a ladle of hot soup into a bowl, spun around. Lily screamed and hid behind her father's legs. Arthur Pendleton stepped into the light, his face pale with fury, as he took in the polished stainless steel, the bubbling pots, and the crowd of vagrants sitting in his ruined building. "What the hell?" Pendleton hissed, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the kitchen. "Is going on in my property?" The silence in the kitchen was absolute, thick enough to choke on. 30 pairs of hollow, terrified eyes locked onto Arthur Pendleton. In his tailored Italian cashmere and polished Oxfords, he looked like an alien entity dropped into a subterranean purgatory. Thomas instinctively stepped in front of Lily, shielding her small frame from the furious billionaire. He didn't drop the ladle. He met Pendleton's icy stare with the quiet, hardened resolve of a man who had already lost everything that mattered, save for the child cowering behind his knees. "You're trespassing on private property." Pendleton's voice was a low, dangerous gravel. He pulled a sleek smartphone from his coat pocket, his thumb hovering over the screen. "I am calling the Chicago Police Department. You will all be arrested for breaking and entering. Squatters' rights be damned. And you," he pointed a manicured finger directly at Thomas, will be charged with child endangerment. That was the trigger, the one threat that could shatter Thomas's stoicism. Please, Thomas said, his voice cracking just a fraction. He slowly lowered the ladle and raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. Call the police if you have to. Arrest me. But do not bring child services into this. We are leaving. Right now. A low murmur of panic rippled through the gathered men and women. Desmond, the old veteran, stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the tile. Wait a minute, mister, Desmond croaked, stepping toward Pendleton. He ain't hurting nobody. He's keeping us alive. Get back, or I swear to God, I will press assault charges too, Pendleton snapped, taking a step back toward the door. As Pendleton retreated, his elbow clipped a small metal prep cart. A chipped ceramic bowl, filled to the brim with Thomas's slow-simmered beef and root vegetable consommé, tipped over. It didn't crash to the floor. Instead, it spilled directly onto the sleeve of Pendleton's $3,000 coat. Pendleton let out a shout of pure outrage, violently shaking his arm. Do you have any idea what this costs? But as he brushed the hot liquid away, the rich, complex aroma of roasted bone marrow, caramelized onions, and fresh thyme hit his senses with the force of a physical blow. Pendleton froze. For a fleeting, involuntary second, his eyes widened. The scent was extraordinary. It bypassed his fury and struck a chord of primal memory, a memory of his grandmother's kitchen in the dead of a Chicago winter, decades before he became a titan of glass and steel. He looked down at the puddle of broth on the stainless steel counter. He looked at the ragged men eating as if it were their last meal. Then, he looked at Thomas. Who cooked this? Pendleton demanded, the anger in his voice momentarily replaced by genuine bewilderment. I did, Thomas said quietly. I was the sous chef at Le Petit Chien downtown before things went bad. Pendleton knew Le Petit Chien. He had dined there with city aldermen. He stared at Thomas, evaluating the filthy clothes, the gaunt face, and the terrified child holding onto his leg. The developer's mind, always calculating, processed the variables. A police raid would mean paperwork. It would mean the city's health and human services department getting involved. It would mean delays to the demolition scheduled for Monday morning. Time was money, and a delay would cost him millions in contractor fees. Pendleton slowly slid his phone back into his pocket. He pulled a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket and began wiping his sleeve. I don't care about your resume, Pendleton said coldly, his brief moment of vulnerability vanishing. This building is structurally unsound, laden with asbestos, and scheduled for demolition on Monday at 6 a.m. I want this place entirely vacated by Friday midnight. If I send my security team here on Saturday morning and find so much as a discarded blanket, I will have the police drag every single one of you to county jail, and your daughter will be in a foster home by lunch. Do we understand each other? Thomas swallowed hard, his hands trembling. Friday midnight, we'll be gone. See that you are, Pendleton sneered. He turned on his heel and strode out into the freezing alley, the heavy steel door slamming shut behind him with an agonizing finality. The heat in the kitchen seemed to vanish with him. The guests put down their spoons. The sanctuary was broken. I'm sorry, everyone, Thomas whispered, kneeling down to pick up a crying Lily. The diner is closed. From the back corner of the room, a man slowly stood up. He was a regular, but he rarely spoke. He wore a faded, oversized trench coat and had a pair of wire-rimmed glasses taped together at the bridge. His name was William Sterling, though everyone called him Bill. What none of the men in the alley knew was that 15 years ago, William Sterling was a senior partner at a top-tier commodities trading firm on LaSalle Street, before a severe bout of undiagnosed bipolar disorder and a devastating market crash dismantled his mind and his life. Bill walked to the center of the kitchen, picking up the discarded ladle. We're not leaving, Bill said, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic, authoritative timbre that hadn't been heard since his trading floor days. Thomas looked at him, exhausted. Bill, you heard the man. He's Arthur Pendleton. He owns half the skyline. We have no legal right to be here. Pendleton operates on leverage, Bill said, tapping his temple. He hates bad press more than he hates squatters. His firm is currently trying to secure a massive tax subsidy from the city council for that new luxury high-rise. If the public finds out, he's evicting a homeless father, a 6-year-old girl, and 30 freezing veterans to build condos for millionaires in the middle of a historic blizzard. The optics would be a catastrophic liability. "How do you know that?" Desmond asked, squinting at Bill. "I used to read the Financial Times." Bill deflected smoothly. He turned to Thomas. "Thomas, you are serving Michelin-quality food out of scavenged scraps. You aren't just surviving, you've built a miracle. We don't run. We make them look at us." "How?" Thomas asked, the desperation evident in his eyes. Bill smiled, a sharp, calculating grin. "I know a guy who knows a guy at the Chicago Tribune. It's time to invite the press to dinner." Thursday evening arrived with a fresh layer of biting frost. The deadline was 24 hours away. The mood inside the brass bell was frantic but focused. Bill Sterling had spent his last $3 at a payphone, calling in a favor from a junior reporter he used to give stock tips to a decade ago. At exactly 11:30 p.m., a knock echoed from the alley door. Desmond opened it to reveal a young man in his late 20s, shivering violently in a thin parka, clutching a notepad. "David Rossi," the young man chattered. "I'm looking for a guy named Bill. He said there was a story here." Desmond pulled him inside. Rossi stopped dead in his tracks. The contrast between the deadly Chicago blizzard outside and the warm, golden glow of the kitchen was staggering. The air was thick with the scent of garlic, rosemary, and braised meat. Thomas was at the stove, turning cheap, discarded cuts of chuck roast, donated by a sympathetic butcher, a few blocks down into a rich, slow-cooked burgundy stew. Bill stepped forward, shaking Rossi's hand. "David, glad you could make it. Welcome to the Midnight Diner." Rossi took out his phone, snapping photos of the polished prep tables, the bubbling pots, and the men sitting with quiet dignity, eating off mismatched plates. He interviewed Thomas while he cooked. Thomas didn't ask for pity. He just talked about the food. He talked about how food was the universal equalizer, how a hot meal could mend a fractured soul, and how his daughter Lily was the reason his heart kept beating. Rossi sat down and tasted the stew. He closed his eyes. It wasn't just good for being cooked in a condemned building. It was one of the best meals he had ever eaten in his life. "My editor is going to think I made this up," Rossi muttered, wiping his bowl clean with a crust of bread. "Write it exactly as you see it," Bill instructed. "And make sure you mention that Arthur Pendleton plans to bulldoze this sanctuary and throw a child back into the snow on Monday." The article, titled "The Secret Sanctuary: How a Homeless Father Built Chicago's Best Restaurant in a Condemned Alley," went live on the Chicago Tribune's digital front page at 6 a.m. on Friday. By 9 a.m., it had been shared 50,000 times. By noon, local news vans were circling the block on 43rd Street, trying to find the hidden entrance. The story had everything: heartbreak, culinary genius, a faceless corporate villain, and a desperate ticking clock. Inside the diner, Thomas was oblivious to the digital firestorm. He was busy packing their meager belongings into a garbage bag. He had promised Pendleton they would be gone by midnight, and he wasn't going to risk losing Lily to the system. At 2 p.m., a massive pounding shook the front of the restaurant, not the alley door, but the heavy plywood boards covering the main street windows. Thomas froze. He grabbed Lily's hand. "They're early. The police are here." But it wasn't the police. Desmond peered through a crack in the plywood and gasped, "Thomas, you need to see this." Thomas walked over and looked through the splintered wood. Out on the snow-covered street, a crowd had gathered, but they weren't armed with eviction notices. They were armed with groceries. Dozens of Chicagoans' nurses off their shifts, college students, local restaurant owners were standing on the sidewalk. One man was hauling a massive sack of premium flour. A woman was carrying a crate of fresh, organic vegetables. A local bakery truck had pulled up, and the driver was unloading racks of fresh brioche and sourdough. "We read the article," a woman shouted toward the boarded-up windows. "We know you're in there. Open the door." Thomas, overwhelmed by a sudden, violent surge of emotion, walked to the front door. He slid the heavy iron deadbolt back. The door creaked open, revealing the bitter cold, but also the warmth of a city that had suddenly decided to care. For the next 10 hours, the brass bell was transformed. Volunteers poured in. Plumbers among the crowd managed to temporarily bypass the city main and restore running water to the sinks. Electricians rigged heavy-duty generators in the alley to power the dining room lights. The dusty, slashed red vinyl booths were scrubbed clean. Thomas wasn't cooking with scavenged scraps anymore. He was cooking with premium ribeyes, fresh truffles, and crates of winter squash. The homeless men and women of the neighborhood didn't just eat. They were served by the citizens of Chicago. It was a chaotic, beautiful symphony of humanity. But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the joyous atmosphere began to curdle with anxiety. Friday was ending. Pendleton's deadline was arriving. Saturday morning dawned with a biting, clear sky. Arthur Pendleton sat in his penthouse office overlooking the lake, his face an immovable mask of rage. His phone had been ringing incessantly for 24 hours. Investors were panicking. The mayor's office had called, politely suggesting he delay the demolition to avoid a public relations catastrophe. Pendleton slammed his fist on his mahogany desk. "I do not yield to squatters. I do not yield to mobs." He picked up the phone and dialed his head of private security. "Get a perimeter team down to 43rd Street immediately. I want that building cleared. If the police won't do it because they're afraid of the cameras, we will remove them for trespassing." By 8 a.m., a fleet of black SUVs pulled up to the intersection of 43rd Street. 24 private security contractors, clad in tactical gear, stepped out. Trailing behind them, reluctantly, were 3 Chicago police cruisers, sent merely to keep the peace. But they couldn't get near the building. Over 500 people had formed a human barricade around the brass bell. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the freezing cold. There were chefs in their white coats, from rival downtown restaurants, teachers, mechanics, and ordinary families. In the center of the crowd stood Bill Sterling, holding a megaphone. "This is private property," the head of Pendleton's security barked through a bullhorn, standing a few feet from the crowd. "You are all in violation of a city eviction order. Disperse immediately. We're waiting for Arthur," Bill yelled back through his megaphone, his voice echoing off the brick buildings. "Tell your boss to come down here and tear this building down himself." Inside the diner, Thomas watched the monitors of a hastily rigged security camera a volunteer had set up. His heart hammered against his ribs. Lily was sitting in a booth, drawing a picture, unaware of the impending violence outside. Thomas grabbed his chef's coat, a brand new, pristine white one, gifted to him by a local supplier the night before, and walked toward the front door. "Thomas, don't go out there," Desmond warned, grabbing his arm. "They'll grab you. They'll take the kid." "I have to," Thomas said, his voice steady. "They're standing out there for us. I can't hide in the kitchen." Thomas pushed through the front doors. A massive cheer erupted from the crowd as he stepped onto the sidewalk. He raised his hands, signaling for quiet. The crowd slowly hushed. Suddenly, a sleek, black town car aggressively pushed its way through the police perimeter, coming to a halt just inches from the human barricade. The back door swung open, and Arthur Pendleton stepped out. The crowd immediately began to boo, a deafening wave of hostility. Pendleton ignored them, his eyes locked entirely on Thomas. He marched up to the police line, flanked by his security. "This is a circus," Pendleton sneered, stopping just a few feet from Thomas, separated only by a line of linked arms. "Do you think this changes anything? Do you think a sob story in the paper alters property law? I own the dirt you're standing on." Thomas looked at the billionaire. He didn't see a monster. He saw a man trapped in a prison of his own wealth and ego. "Mr. Pendleton," Thomas said loudly, projecting his voice so the local news microphones could pick it up. "You are right. You own the building. You have the legal right to tear it down, but you're a businessman. You deal in value." Pendleton narrowed his eyes. "What's your point?" "Your company, Pendleton and Hayes, is currently bidding on the South Side Revitalization Project," Thomas said. It was a piece of intel Bill Sterling had briefed him on an hour ago. "It's a $2 billion city contract. If you bulldoze a community kitchen that the entire city has rallied behind today, the city council will never award you that contract. The political fallout will ruin you. Pendleton's jaw tightened. He knew the homeless chef was right. The optics were utterly toxic. "So, what are you proposing, Caldwell?" Pendleton asked quietly, stepping closer so the cameras couldn't hear. "Extortion? A transaction," Thomas corrected him. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his apron pocket. "This building is a write-off for you. It's asbestos-ridden, as you said. The lot is small. Sell it to me." Pendleton let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Sell it to you? With what money? You were eating out of dumpsters a month ago?" "I don't have the money," Thomas admitted. "But they do." Thomas pointed to a man standing near the front of the crowd. It was David Rossi, the reporter. Next to him stood a wealthy local venture capitalist who had read the article and driven down that morning. "We have crowdfunded $500,000 since 6 a.m., Thomas said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "And investors are lining up to turn the Brass Bell into a non-profit cooperative restaurant. We will buy the building from you at 50% above market value. You walk away with a profit, you get a massive PR win for donating to a charitable cause, and your city contracts remain safe." Pendleton stared at Thomas. The developer was cornered, but he was also impressed. He looked at the massive crowd, the news cameras, and then back at the man in the chef's coat. "You're a ruthless negotiator, Caldwell," Pendleton murmured. "I have a daughter to protect," Thomas replied, not blinking. "Do we have a deal?" The freezing air hung heavy over 43rd Street, amplifying the silence of the 500 people waiting with bated breath. Arthur Pendleton, a man who had built an empire by crushing his opposition, stared at the homeless chef in the pristine white coat. The venture capitalist, Jonathan Higgins, stepped forward, ready to present the escrow account details on his tablet. The local news cameras zoomed in, their red recording lights unblinking. Pendleton let out a slow, frosty breath that plumed in the air. He looked at the crowd, then down at his expensive leather shoes, and finally back to Thomas Caldwell. "You think you have me backed into a corner, Caldwell," Pendleton said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register meant only for Thomas and the immediate circle to hear. "You think $500,000 of pity money buys my pride? This lot alone is appraised at $3.2 million. Your crowdfunded pocket change is an insult." A murmur of despair rippled through the front row of the crowd. Thomas's heart sank, but he held his ground, his jaw set. "Then, name your price." "We will raise it." "No, you won't," Pendleton snapped. He adjusted his cashmere scarf, a cold, calculating gleam replacing the anger in his eyes. "I don't do charity, and I despise being strong-armed by the press, but I am a gambling man, and I appreciate a man who knows how to leverage a weak hand. So, I will propose a wager. A binding, legal contract, right here, right now." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "What kind of wager?" "I will lease you this building and the land it sits on for exactly 1 year, starting today. The rent will be $1, Pendleton said. The crowd gasped, but Pendleton raised a finger, silencing them. "However, in that 12-month period, the Brass Bell must operate as a fully licensed, code-compliant business. You will pass every health inspection, pay every tax, and you must generate exactly $1 million in gross revenue, not donations. Not GoFundMe handouts. Revenue, sold food." Pendleton leaned in, his eyes boring into Thomas's. "If you hit $1 million by midnight on Christmas Eve next year, I will sign the deed over to you for free. You keep the building forever. But if you are short by a single, solitary penny, I seize the restaurant, I seize your equipment, I bulldoze the lot on Christmas Day, and I will personally see to it that you are prosecuted for extortion. Do we have a deal, chef?" It was a suicide mission. Building $1 million restaurant from a condemned shell in 12 months was statistically impossible, especially for a man who didn't even have a bank account yesterday. Thomas looked back at the diner. He saw Desmond standing in the doorway, his old military jacket zipped tight. He saw Bill Sterling pushing his taped glasses up the bridge of his nose. And through the glass, he saw Lily, safe and warm. Thomas turned back to the billionaire and extended his scarred, burn-marked hand. "Draft the paperwork," Mr. Pendleton, we open in a month." Pendleton shook his hand. The crowd erupted into a deafening roar of triumph, unaware of the lethal terms of the agreement, but the clock had already started ticking. The next 12 months were a brutal, agonizing crucible. The $500,000 raised by Jonathan Higgins and the public went entirely into gutting and rebuilding the brass bell. The asbestos was cleared, the plumbing was replaced. A state-of-the-art commercial kitchen was installed where the rusted prep tables once stood. But Thomas refused to abandon the soul of what he had built. He and Bill Sterling, acting as the restaurant's ruthless financial director, established a dual model system. The front of the house, looking out onto the now bustling 43rd Street, was a high-end, reservation-only bistro serving Thomas's extraordinary culinary creations to Chicago's elite. The back of the house, accessible through the same alley door Thomas had broken open, remained the Midnight Diner, a permanent, free soup kitchen operating from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., funded entirely by the profits of the front. Desmond was made the official general manager of the alley operations, trading his ragged coats for a tailored suit, greeting the city's forgotten with the same dignity a maitre d' would offer a senator. The restaurant was a sensation. Critics flocked to it. Clara Bowden, the most feared food critic in the Midwest, wrote a scathing review of the neighborhood but ended her column by calling Thomas's braised short rib a religious experience that demands your life savings. But the overhead was astronomical. The taxes, the premium ingredients, the massive payroll to ensure his staff, many of whom were the very homeless veterans who had huddled in the alley with him, were paid living wages. As December approached, the stress began to fracture Thomas. He was working 20-hour days, sleeping on a cot in the office. The ghost of Arthur Pendleton's wager hung over him like a guillotine. On the evening of December 24th, exactly 1 year to the day since Thomas had smashed the padlock with an iron pipe, the snow was falling heavily over Chicago once again. The dining room was packed, the kitchen was a symphony of shouting cooks and clashing pans, and Lily, now 7, was sitting at the manager's desk, doing her math homework. Bill Sterling walked into the kitchen, his face pale, clutching a ledger. He pushed Thomas into the walk-in refrigerator, away from the chaos. "I just ran the final numbers for the night," Bill said, his voice shaking. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Give it to me straight, Bill," Thomas said, wiping sweat from his forehead with a towel. "We've served every reservation. The kitchen is closing in an hour, including tonight's projected receipts. We are at $960,000. Bill looked at the floor. "We're $40,000 short, Thomas. We failed." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He leaned against the metal shelving, the cold air of the refrigerator chilling the sweat on his skin. $40,000. It might as well have been 40 million. Tomorrow morning, Pendleton would arrive with the bulldozers. The dream was over. Thomas walked out of the walk-in, his heart shattered, but his face a mask of calm. He had to finish service. He had to feed the people in the alley tonight. At exactly 11 p.m., the front dining room had cleared out. The staff was cleaning the floors. Thomas was at the stove, preparing the massive vats of root vegetable and beef consommé for the alley guests. Suddenly, the front door chime rang. "We're closed," Desmond called out from the host stand. "I have a reservation," a cold, familiar voice replied. Thomas froze. He walked out of the kitchen. Standing in the foyer, brushing snow off his identical cashmere coat, was Arthur Pendleton. He was alone. "Mr. Pendleton," Thomas said, his voice hollow. "You're early. The bulldozers aren't scheduled until tomorrow." Pendleton ignored the jab. He walked over to the best booth in the house, the very same booth Thomas had padded with blankets for Lily a year ago, and sat down. "I said, I have a reservation, Caldwell. I want to eat, and I want the tasting menu." Thomas stared at him. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back into the kitchen. He didn't cook with anger. He cooked with the profound, heartbreaking realization that this was the last meal he would ever serve in the brass bell. He poured every ounce of his soul, his grief, and his love into the food. He served Pendleton the pan-seared scallops with truffle foam. He served the famous braised short rib. And for the final course, Thomas brought out a chipped ceramic bowl. Inside was the simple, slow-simmered beef bone broth with root vegetable hash and a side of flatbread. The exact meal that had spilled on Pendleton's sleeve a year ago. Pendleton looked at the bowl. He picked up the spoon and took a bite. For 10 minutes, the billionaire sat in complete silence, finishing every last drop of the broth and wiping the bowl clean with the flatbread. Thomas stood a few feet away, waiting for the executioner to drop the axe. Pendleton pulled a silk napkin across his mouth. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a checkbook, and clicked a heavy gold pen. He scribbled across the paper, tore the check free, and left it face down on the table. Pendleton stood up, buttoning his coat. He walked past Thomas, stopping briefly at the door. The scallops were slightly over-seasoned, Pendleton said, his face unreadable. But the broth was acceptable. Merry Christmas, chef. The bell chimed, and Pendleton disappeared into the blizzard. Thomas let out a shaky breath. He walked over to the booth to clear the table. He picked up the check Pendleton had left behind. Thomas stopped breathing. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, sure that the exhaustion was making him hallucinate. The check was made out to the Brass Bell Cooperative. The memo line simply read, "For the broth." The amount was for exactly $40,000. A choked sob escaped Thomas's throat. Bill Sterling burst out of the office, holding his laptop. "Thomas, the bank account. An electronic deposit just cleared. We hit the million. We hit the million." Thomas collapsed into the booth, burying his face in his hands, weeping uncontrollably. Lily ran out from the back, wrapping her small arms around his neck. Desmond and the kitchen staff crowded around, cheering, crying, holding on to each other. They had done the impossible. They had beaten the winter, they had beaten the system, and they had thawed the coldest heart in Chicago. The Brass Bell stands today not just as a culinary landmark in Chicago, but as a monument to human resilience. Thomas Caldwell transformed a rusted, condemned kitchen into a beacon of hope, proving that rock bottom can be the foundation for something extraordinary. Desmond, once a ghost on the streets, now runs the front of house with military precision, while Bill Sterling manages the cooperative's thriving finances. And Lily, the little girl who almost froze in an alley, practically runs the pastry station after school. They started with a broken padlock, frozen snow, and 50 pounds of ancient flour. They ended up feeding the soul of an entire city. Arthur Pendleton's brutal ultimatum didn't break them, it forged them. Ultimately, this story reminds us that the warmest fires are often lit in the darkest, coldest rooms.